This is the North Carolina Rabbit Hole. I am Jeremy Markovich, and we're going to look at politics today. I know. But as I sit here talking to you now, there's an election coming up. You may be listening to this on election day, or maybe a week after election day, or I don't know, years from now. But one of the things that always comes up, one of the things I'm fascinated by, no matter what happens in any election, is this sort of thing that is guiding everything, but nobody really ever talks about. During an election cycle, you have a lot of candidates that come out and they campaign, they make talking points, and they address their policies, and they make gotcha videos and memes and all this other stuff. And yet there is this sort of background that influences everything that a candidate does, or where they decide to spend their money, or how they decide to talk, or who they decide to talk to. And really, that is what I wanted to get into today. So I figured there's probably a guy out there who can kind of give me the anatomy of a purple state. And so I was like, well, I'm kind of lazy. Let me just get the guy who wrote the book called Anatomy of a Purple State. That is Chris Cooper. He teaches political science at Western Carolina University. And he is with me now. Hey, Chris.
Hey, good to see you, Jeremy.
So one of the things that I kind of liken this to is, like, if you look at the stock market every single minute, you can watch it go up and down just a little bit, and it probably will make you crazy. And you can do the same thing with politics. But if you zoom out and you look at stuff like, I don't know, financial reports, or like what the stock market on a particular company has done over 5 years, you get a much better and more complete picture. So that's kind of what I want to do with you today. And I want to start with a question that I feel like I think about a lot. I think people ask a lot, which is, what makes North Carolina different than the states around it? So you have, Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, my God, South Carolina, and they're all very different than North Carolina politically. So I know this is a really easy question that probably has a very short answer, right? What is the answer to that, Chris? How do you explain that?
So many things. Yeah, such an easy one. No, I think part of it, like, if you look at the history of North Carolina and look at the history of the South, right? So there's this long period where the South is dominated by the Democratic Party, called it the one-party Democratic South. And in all of those years, North Carolina was a little bit of an exception. It was never quite as democratic as its southern neighbors were, right? Like people like Jesse Helms were getting elected in North Carolina when Republicans weren't getting elected anywhere else in the South. And so as the rest of the South went from overwhelmingly Democratic to, let's say in the case of what you just called, I believe, my God, South Carolina, they went to completely Republican, right? And so we're now not as Republican as those neighbors. So it's like the whole region went from 12 o'clock on a clock to 6 o'clock, right? From completely Democratic to completely Republican. It's like we've been hanging out at 345 for the better part of 30 years. And I think that explains a lot of it. Like, everybody thinks, the purple politics just started when Barack Obama won North Carolina, and then maybe it went away after that. But the reality, I think, is that we've actually been experiencing this purple politics for a long time. It just came from a little bit of a different perspective. We've always been, and I think will remain, a little bit distinct from our southern neighbors.
How much of that is baked into history, or how much does history have to do with where we are today? And, they're just sort of the inertia, right? Like, just that people have been doing things a certain way, and they just sort of continue to do things that way. Like, right? Like, how does North Carolina history play into what is still happening in the year 2024?
It plays in a ton, right? Because the history ultimately affects the demographic patterns of who lives where. And that political geography is increasingly, like, we use that to predict everything now. And so if you think about, all right, I live in Silva, I live in Jackson County. It is not a very racially diverse place, never has been. And that absolutely affects its politics today as compared to, let's just say, the eastern part of the state. So look, they require me to wonk things up when they give me a PhD. So I'm going to do it for, maybe I've been doing it this whole time, but I'm going to really do it now. There's a couple of political scientists who have this term behavioral path dependence. And I know I just went to sleep too, but it's trying to describe exactly what you're talking about, Jeremy. The idea that attitudes, behaviors, opinions about politics get passed down from generation to generation, right? You see the behavior have this kind of path dependence. These political scientists that talk about it, they use it when they're talking about enslavement. Places where the larger numbers of people were enslaved have fundamentally different politics today than places where fewer people were enslaved. And so they say, hey, this is because the way attitudes are passed down and the way political geography affects who we are and how we believe about the state of the world.
And in North Carolina, I feel like there is such a big diversity of place and geography, demographics, that sort of thing. And one of the things that leads me to write about it, be so curious about it, is the fact that you have the mountains and the coast. You have places that were very progressive. You have places that were very much not. You have people in urban areas and rural areas, and you have like places that are blowing up and everyone wants to move there. And there's other places where they're just kind of barely hanging on. You can kind of look around and almost never see the same story twice. And so I'm wondering, as different pockets of North Carolina have evolved, how have the politics maybe evolved differently? So like what are some examples of places in North Carolina where you have very distinct pockets that look almost nothing like each other?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So, book's called Anatomy of a Purple State. I think when you aggregate the state together, it looks pretty purple, but that doesn't mean we got 100 purple counties. Quite the opposite. Doesn't mean you got 7.5 million purple voters running around. Quite the opposite, right? You've got about the same number of blue and red folks, not the same number of blue and red counties now. And we'll get to that in a second when we talk about rural parts of our state. But you're right. I mean, the state is incredibly diverse. I mean, there are counties in our state that are majority minority. In other words, the majority of the people who live in those counties are, identify as minorities. And then you got a place like Graham County where there, at least at the time I wrote the book, there were 9 African-American registered voters in that county. I did not hiccup there. I didn't mean to say 9%. I mean, like, you take 2 hands, you take away your thumb on one of them, 9 African-American registered voters, like radically different worlds. And so what's happened is, as the rural parts of our state have become increasingly Republican and the urban parts of our state are increasingly liberal, and everybody knows where we are today, I don't think everybody recognizes how recent this is. So in 2000, Buncombe County, which is, houses Asheville, of course, Mecklenburg County, which of course houses Charlotte, those 2 counties voted for George W. Bush, the Republican candidate for president. As recently as 1992, the rural areas of our state were more Democratic than the urban areas of our state, which is kind of a mind word I can't say on a very nice family podcast like this, right? Like it sort of runs counter to everything we think we know about American politics. So that urban-rural realignment that we've seen throughout the South has changed our state. And because we have the second most rural voters in the state, means that those rural places still have political power, much more so than they do certainly in other battleground states.
So, when you're talking about all these different places and they kind of evolve very differently, and it's hard to paint with a broad brush in North Carolina, obviously. Yes. Even though you're saying it's a battleground state, there's very few voters that are really up in play, I guess.
Right.
When you look at that and you look back at the history and you kind of say, well, okay, things have always been the way maybe that they've been, or they've been the same way for 30 years and they've kind of just evolved very slowly. Are there moments in history where like things took a drastic turn or lurched forward or lurched backwards? Like where you have, instead of having a linear chart, all of a sudden now the chart goes straight up and now you're at a different place, almost maybe overnight.
Yep. For my money, the most important election in modern American history, and certainly in modern North Carolina history, was 2010. And that's not the one that folks tend to look at, right? You think, well, certainly, Chris, you pick a presidential election, but I'm not at all, right? That's the year that we went from Democratic control for 100 years of our state legislature to Republican control. All right. So this was part of this bigger Republican movement nationally. It's brilliant politics. They had this thing called Project Red Map. It's not hard to figure out what the goal of Project Red Map was. It was to draw more red maps. So the Democrats in 2010, they're high on the federal government. Barack Obama's president. They're feeling good about themselves. The Republican Party said, what if we invest in the states? What if we invest in state legislatures? What if we put our money where we're going to get more bang for our buck? And they did, and it worked. And so they flipped the North Carolina General Assembly. They also flipped hundreds of other seats across the country and over a dozen chambers total. And then in 2011, when it came time to redraw maps, the Republican Party was the ones in charge of drawing those maps. So it was not a linear movement. It was this massive interruption to what we thought was probably a slow movement towards republicanism that then just went through the roof in terms of the policies we get out of our state government.
I have heard Republicans call themselves the party of Lincoln, but I don't know how much they actually resemble the party that Lincoln presided over back when he was governor, or not governor, my goodness. He was president, right? Lincoln was president. I want to fact check that. I want
The
to
guy
fact
with the
check that
beard?
with the political. Yeah, the guy with the beard, the big hat. Yeah, that guy was president. But one of the things about it was like the parties have they have the same names, but they have changed position over time. How have these parties in North Carolina really changed over the last 100 so years?
Yeah, radically. I mean, in some ways, I do wish we just changed the name at some point and just called them something else, right? Because they don't resemble their former selves much at all. So, for less in North Carolina than the rest of the South, but generally speaking, the Democrats controlled almost everything. Everybody was a Democrat to some degree, right? So in 1977, it's like 3 in every 4 registered voters in our state is a Democrat. Now, that didn't mean that you had a bunch of AOC lovers running around the state of North Carolina or whatever the equivalent of that would have been, right? Ideology, whether you're liberal or conservative, partisanship, whether you're Democrat or Republican, those are aligned now, right? If I say, hey, I have a friend who's a conservative, you say, well, he's a Republican or she's a Republican. And if I say I have a friend who's liberal, that person is a Democrat. That wasn't true for a very long time in North Carolina politics. So you had ideology was kind of this messy mix, but partisanship was something different. It was like you could pull for a team in terms of partisanship, but that didn't necessarily mean what you believed about abortion or gay rights or anything else. And so after the civil rights movement, we started seeing ideology and partisanship become much, much, much more aligned. And really, after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, when you saw massive numbers of African Americans get enfranchised essentially overnight, that's when whites in the South left the Democratic Party and started moving to the Republican Party. And this happened even more in majority minority counties, right? So you had whites who had been in charge since before the beginning of the country. A large number of African Americans gets enfranchised. They start losing control of their party. And so then they switch parties, go to the Republican Party. And then over the course of time, you start to see them shift and sort almost perfectly into liberal and conservative.
So we've kind of talked about the history and things that are going on. I'm interested also in this other thing that I think you learn about in 4th grade. It's the state constitution, right? And like my son, when he was in 4th grade, was like, oh, here are all the state symbols. Here are all these interesting things about, how you get a bill passed. But I feel like the North Carolina Constitution, the way that it's set up, like the basics of it, play another role here. And they end up having this effect that changes things from other states. And one of this doesn't have to do with politics necessarily, but one of the things that I always thought was interesting was, somebody said, why doesn't North Carolina have any speed trap towns? Like, why doesn't like the mayor of some small town in North Carolina say, we have like $1,000 budget hole this month. Can you go out and write like $1,000 worth of tickets? Then the police officers go do that. That doesn't happen in North Carolina. And it's not because, there's anything better or worse about the police here or wherever else. It is just the state's constitution says all the money that you would collect from something like that would have to go back to the local school district, right? And so it doesn't make any economic sense for them to go out and have speed trap towns. And that is something, it's not because there's a great law about it. It's because the Constitution says that you just can't take that kind of money and do whatever you want with it. So how that sort of plays into politics and how it creates, how people look at how they vote for legislators or a governor or even other smaller offices. Like, how does this big constitution in North Carolina set up what happens in politics across the state?
So many different ways. And I love that speed trap example. I'm thinking like some big music fan, Jason Isbell, has a song Speed Trap Town, right? And I'm thinking that's about Alabama. He ain't writing it about North Carolina, right? For just that reason.
Yeah.
So yeah, look, we've had 3 constitutions in the state of North Carolina. So the U.S. Constitution, if I said, hey, the country should rewrite its constitution, people would have me drawn and quartered, right? State constitutions, we tend to do it though. We tend to draw up new state constitutions fairly frequently, 3 in our state's history, and all sorts of the ways about how that's set up have changed our politics. So just a few I'll grab. We have, if you've gone to vote during 2024, you noticed it is a big old ballot in North Carolina. We have 10 Council of State seats, right? So governor, lieutenant governor, labor, education, treasurer, auditor. And I defy most people to tell me the difference between the treasurer and the auditor, right? Like you have to look it up to find out the difference. So we are making our ballots longer. Why? Because the state constitution says it needs to be this way. So that's one. Our governor is arguably the weakest institutional governor in the United States of America. We didn't give the governor the veto power until the 1990s. Like this is 100 years after every other state. And so the General Assembly has reigned supreme in our state since the beginning, right? It's not first among equals, like you say, when you think about, the United States Constitution. This is first among first. Like this is the one branch that matters the most. And then what's really interesting, and I think a little disturbing, is that this group of people we give the most power to, we pay a whopping $13,951 a year to. And we wonder why we tend to get some policies that don't make a lot of sense. Like, could you quit your job right now? I'm not asking Jeremy, but somebody's listening. Quit your job now to make $13,951. And oh, by the way, you get $104 a day for per diem, and good luck finding a Hampton Inn in Raleigh for $104 per day, right? It's just not happening. So the way our Constitution's set up says you get the power, folks, but you don't really get the resources. I mean, there's a host of other sort of things that are embedded in our state constitution, but that's the main one I tend to think of is about institutional power.
First, you get the election. Then you get the per diem. That's $100 a day.
That's right.
Then you get the power.
And you go to work in the ugliest state capitol building and state legislative building in America, arguably. So there's that too.
Okay, this is my weird tangent, is that like I used to work one summer for a masonry company, and it makes me crazy about how all of the cinder block walls in that building, like they're just vertical, they're not staggered. And I'm like, if you push, I always feel like if you push like on the wrong wall in the wrong way in that building, that the whole thing will just kind of collapse down upon you.
It's either going to collapse or it's going to be like national treasure, and you're going to find something. You don't have young kids because I watch this stuff. I will say it in a rabbit hole like way. Some folks may not know that building, the North Carolina Legislative Building, was designed by the same person that designed the Kennedy Center. So it's actually a very famous architect who designed a lot of very ugly buildings.
But the nice thing is they have the nice red carpet right up the middle and the stairs that nobody ever walks on. So that's a bonus. I digress. Let's stop making snarky comments about the legislative building. They might write a log about us if we keep on doing that too much. Like that is one of the things I guess I'm interested in too. Is like, again, you're talking to somebody who writes a newsletter called the North Carolina Rabbit Hole, and I feel like there are a lot of little things, like little quirky things that pop up that really explain bigger things about North Carolina politics, right? So these are like the little things that if you take to a party and you're like, I got something for you. Here's a little quite funny little story. Did you know? And then you just try to blow people's minds. And I'm sure as a political, scientist, you have many of these, and you're very popular. I want to know, like, what are some of your favorite things or like little stories that you can tell about, the political system or people in North Carolina that like illustrate maybe a larger truth about what we're dealing with here?
Sure. Yeah. Probably my favorite one is about the gubernatorial veto, strangely enough. So we have, like I said, pretty weak very weak governor, last state in the country to give the governor the veto power. When we did give the governor the veto power, we gave the governor very, very weak veto power. And so the way you might notice this as a North Carolina citizen is the governor of North Carolina does not get to veto or say no to legislative or congressional maps, any redistricting maps. So just imagine for a second in, alternate world A or B, we are in a world where the Governor Cooper could have vetoed these legislative maps. We'd probably spend a lot less money on litigation. We'd have, different kinds of maps, different forms of representation. So the fun story to connect to your question about how that happened is 100 years after everybody else, we finally decide to get the veto. We debate a bunch of different possible vetoes, and the one that wins is this weak veto, right? Well, the state senator who proposed and sponsored, it was the primary sponsor of that bill, was a Nash County senator named Roy Cooper. And so I wonder often, like, does Roy Cooper today look back at old Roy Cooper and say, man, I could have made that veto just like a little bit stronger, and I could have changed the state in ways that, he would like to have them changed. So that's probably my favorite one because it illustrates that the shoe is often on the other foot eventually, and that we oftentimes make policies for strategic reasons in the short run with the idea that things are never going to change, but inevitably they always do.
Yeah. One of the things actually you brought up is gerrymandering, and this is one of these things where I wonder to myself, are we just upset about this now, or have people always been upset about this about this? In the fact that, yeah, if whoever's in charge can kind of choose their own districts, and it was just a drastic change, like you said, in 2010 when the Republicans took control, and it just like flipped overnight, and suddenly they became like they had enough votes to win, and now all of a sudden they're like in complete control. So, is gerrymandering, getting too much credit? Is it getting not enough credit? Or is it sort of like the anger over that just right?
I think the anger over it is probably just right. It is not the only reason for our politics today. There are, so the folks who want to defend these maps will often say that there is also these sort of residential segregate, these patterns where people tend to set, to like live around people like them. And that's definitely true. Like I tell my students, I'll give them extra credit if they'll find me a Republican in West Asheville. Nobody's ever gotten extra credit, right? Like people just tend to settle around people who are like them. And so if you draw a map around, city of Asheville, city of Charlotte, whatever it happens to be, you're probably going to draw a map that could look gerrymandered. That's absolutely true. At the same time, there's also no question that that kind of pattern also makes it pretty easy to draw maps to benefit one party, right? You can just walk down the street and probably identify, is this a Republican neighborhood or a Democratic neighborhood? And as the parties have sorted again into ideology and into culture, right? Republicans and Democrats drink different beer, they listen to different music, they drive different cars and trucks. All of that stuff in some ways makes it easier. With all that said, I think that where the blame may go too much is the idea, I think, for folks that are newer to the state, they may think, well, this is a uniquely Republican problem. And I think as the Republicans will point out correctly, the Democrats did all sorts of gerrymandering, maybe not quite as effectively, but they did it for a whole long time. In the 1940s, they would draw what they call bacon strip districts from the western part of the state to the eastern part of the state to smother out the Republican voters. And the Wall Street Journal talked about the democratically drawn maps as computer-generated pornography in the 1980s. There's all sorts of examples of the Democrats when they had power also drawing gerrymandered maps. And then in the sort of ironic twist piece, the Republicans complaining about it. So I love to look at old newspaper articles from the 2001 redraw, because you'll see, like, I don't know if you know this guy, Stoney Rushing. I think he recently passed away, but he's a Republican. He used to dress up like Boss Hogg when he ran for office.
Yeah, Union County.
But Union County, exactly.
Yeah.
He would write letters to the editor that would talk about how the Democrats need to quit gerrymandering, right? I mean, it's a complete flip. It's an opposite day of what we've got today. And then you read the Democratic response and they'd say, no, we're doing everything within the letter of the law. It's just that people tend to live in different kinds of places. So it is a people in power problem, not a Democratic problem or a Republican problem. And if you doubt that today, go talk to people in New York or Illinois about who's drawing those maps that look pretty gerrymandered.
You and I are not going to get into every single nook and cranny of what's going on in North Carolina politics. That's what your book is for. But I think one of the things, I'm interested in North Carolina, obviously, because I've lived here for almost 20 years. I think it's a fascinating place. I also think that it's not too much of a stretch to say that a lot of what we think of as politics in general has just become nationalized. Mm-hmm. And so maybe this is a good place for a dividing line here to say, all right, where have politics really become nationalized in North Carolina, and where are they still not, right? Like, and has this been the case, or again, is this just something we're noticing and pointing out now because it just happens to be happening now?
Yeah, there's no question that we have increasingly nationalized politics. One of the themes that I try to draw out in the book actually is about nationalization, the increasing nationalization. I just a few minutes ago got off the phone with a journalists from Canada. And they said, well, what are the unique issues to North Carolina in this election, in this campaign? Totally reasonable question. But frankly, I gave her an answer that somebody in North Dakota probably could have given, somebody in Oregon probably could have given, somebody in Connecticut probably could have given, right? The issues are pretty much the same. The way the candidates run campaigns in terms of their messaging is probably the same. The strategies are different in North Carolina, right? So our state is pretty diffuse in terms of population. We do have more rural voters than in any other state except for the state of Texas. We are not dominated by one city like Atlanta tends to dominate Georgia politics. And so if you're running a campaign or if you're trying to figure out how to build a coalition of voters, you've got to build it across a larger swath of land, across multiple media markets, often which bleed into other states. So in terms of like how much money is translating to actual votes, it's kind of less of a good bet here in North Carolina. And I think you put all that together and you do see some different strategies and our politics play out in different ways. I think it's about the ways in which geography plays with politics today more so than it's about a different issue set.
Last question. What is your favorite story that you've come across in researching this book, or just, having been a political scientist for so long?
It's a great question. I already sort of blew it a little bit because I do love the Roy Cooper story about the veto. That's, I think, a really good one. Oh, Jeremy, you got me stumped a little bit here.
That's what I was trying to do.
That's you
just to make you stumble around on.
That's
on
right.
Podcast.
That's right. Game, set, match. Jeremy Markovich once again.
Mm-hmm.
All right. It's maybe too referential to our host, but the best way I know how to explain gerrymandering in the state of North Carolina is to go actually where you went and ran what I believe you described as the worst 5K of your life, around West Asheville, North Carolina. And I think it's just the perfect way to illustrate how gerrymandering works. So the quick version of that story is the 11th Congressional District, where I'm talking to you from today. He used to be represented by a guy named Heath Schuler, right? He was a really great football player, and then he had some toe problems, I believe, for the Washington Redskins. Later became a real estate agent, ran for Congress, won, and he was the most conservative in Congress, a Democratic member of Congress by every metric there is, right? Every metric that's possible. He tried to run against Nancy Pelosi. He liked his guns a lot, presumably still does, wasn't real sure about abortion. He's a conservative, and he fit the district. This was the most competitive district of the 11th in the state of North Carolina. Then after that big shift in 2010 and then 2011 maps, like we talked about before, they carved out the city of Asheville, Louisiana Avenue, and put a bunch of the Democrats in Buncombe County into the 10th Congressional District, he of the big gavel, right, Patrick McHenry. And then the 11th went overnight from the most competitive to the most Republican district in the state. Heath Schuler then decides to spend more time with his family, not run again. Guy named Mark Meadows, who becomes pretty politically influential, decides that maybe he'll run for office. Super crowded primary. He wins. Eventually, he becomes chief of staff, of course, for President Trump. The timing of his sort of leaving office was really interesting. He puts it on a Wednesday, and you're saying, Chris, why do you care about days of the week? And the reason is, everybody, if you wanted to pull out from one office and run for another, the deadline was Monday. So he couldn't do that. But Friday was the deadline to run. So he's trying to lock out folks who might want to have political ambition, but he wants to make sure he can get his friend to run and win in his seat. So he announced that he's going to not run for office. And then a woman named Linda Bennett decides that she is going to run in that spot. She's almost like she's been told off. She does have a website maybe a few hours before his announcement, and people think she's likely to win. But this guy named Madison Cawthorn from Henderson County says, you know what, maybe I'll run for office. And of course, that was the birth of whatever became of the Madison Cawthorn time in office. So I think it's just kind of a fascinating story of place and how like these weird institutional rules moved a place from the most competitive, moderate place in the state to however you want to define Mark Meadows and Madison Cawthorn in the better part of 10 years.
Well, I think, going from the very beginning to Madison Cawthorn is a good place to end. So, Chris, this is always a lot of fun talking with you about this sort of thing. And I really appreciate you joining me. And this is great. And got to pick up your book, Anatomy of a Purple State. It is out. You can read it. It'll get into much more than we were able to get into here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always fun.
This has been the North Carolina Rabbit Hole. I'm Jeremy Markovich. I will talk to you again soon. Literally, the kids just walked in the door. So, hit that. I mean, like right on, because now they're making a bunch of noise.
Perfect.